Welcome to In the Landscape, a podcast on all things landscape design and care related, with your hosts Kate and Charles Sadler. And it's that time again for another episode of In the Landscape. Thank you all for joining us for another week of a landscape design, care, general interest topic. We're excited to bring you the third in our series. Our first attempt at a series, I guess, or at least a consecutive series, because we've done, the right plant in the right place, perennials, shrubs, trees. But this one we thought we'd record sort of back to back and see if we could explore kind of the compare and contrast of the different basic kind of broadest category of living environment, the rural, urban, and suburban. And I am one of your hosts. My name is Kate Sadler. And with me in the studio is my co-host,
Charles Sadler.
Hi, Charles. So we're excited if you're joining us for the very first time. We encourage you to go back and listen. Hopefully there are back episodes in our back catalog that will touch on a design topic of interest for you. And if you've followed us through this journey, thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in each week. Almost each week. We try to be very consistent about recording. Every once in a while, it's a challenge, but yeah, so busy week, even though we're here, I guess, on a holiday weekend kind of recording and getting this episode bundled and ready to go.
It's like the mark of end of summer in the U.S.
Yes.
It's Labor Day weekend. Memorial Day it begins sort of where you start wearing your seersuckers or your white pants.
Or white, yes.
These like old-fashioned traditions.
Yeah, and of course, somewhat tied to the seasons, especially if you're living in the Northeast or Midwest. Anywhere that starts to get cold this time of year, you really begin to feel it.
Oh, right.
Some of us, California's hitting record heat right now.
There was somebody, a fellow horticulturalist was posting, I think they're in France, they're having their first wood fire, like first indoor fire.
Well, there you go.
Of the year. So.
Yeah. So we're a ways away from that. We still have the air conditioner on here in Texas. I've been really thrilled that our AC is wind powered. Duh. It's Texas, wind powered here. There's a lot of wind in Texas. So
there's almost always a prevailing wind.
Yeah, every time I think
Texas.
About how much we run the air conditioner, I'm like, well, it's renewable. So there's that. What else? We're starting to roll our classes back out. We were very excited to get accredited, to be developing them. You've taught some synchronous classes that have been very successful on a range of topics. We have some that are design related, some that are pruning related, there's some for everyone, and some that are just straight science, botany, sort of ecology.
Horticulture.
Yes.
Plant selection.
Yes. And so we kind of ran into, as maybe has happened in other areas of our lives these days, production schedule situation, working from home and having the team kind of scattered. But we're back on track. We're getting those back up on the website. So
we're finding like new efficiencies too. I think different. How can we move things forward?
Well, you certainly get better at something the more you do it too. So my background is a pretty high level of educational wherewithal. So it's like the knowledge is there, but then implementing is a whole other thing, as we kind of know from the design world and stuff. So anyway, for anybody who was like confused, they may have seen a post or heard us mention it on the show. Those are coming out. They are typically asynchronous, so you can take them at your own pace. But we have students responding with, one design assignment is to submit your plant palette so that you can get feedback. And we're seeing plant palettes come in from other regions. It's great because we can give the design feedback and then do our sort of due diligence to kind of understand the ecology of the place. And that's been a lot of fun.
Right. It's fun to research.
Yeah. So feel free to check that out. And heading into our fall season, it's nice having projects kind of all over the country. I know it's kind of hurry up and get stuff planted in the Northeast for a lot of the United States, of course, for a lot of our clients up there.
And for pruning too, we're getting, like a big part of our practice is pruning gardens, supervising, consulting, training other people how to prune. So for ornamental plants, like evergreen plants, September's the window in the Northeast. Yeah. Or it could be the same in the Midwest or Pacific Northwest, probably. And if you prune, you have like some have a holly hedge, let's say, if you do that after September, the active pruning encourages new growth, and then the new growth can get frost burn.
Right.
So it's generally, like I use the guideline, the latest you ought to prune is about 2 months before your frost.
That's good.
So in Texas, there's not always a frost, but it's about the middle of December. And so the middle of October is 2 months before that. So that's sort of the cutoff. And so we do a fair amount of research. So when we're implementing large-scale pruning projects, sometimes it's thousands of plants or hundreds of feet of hedges, that we're conservative. That doesn't cause a problem.
All right. So even though this episode is on a totally different topic from pruning, we almost can't let an opportunity pass if it means a chance to kind of talk about or educate about what's good for plants and kind of reflect on our own learning experiences. I think that's what gives us the enthusiasm to do the podcast and to start the classes and to be engaging in that way, write articles and things like that, is this sort of interconnectedness of learning new things and then sharing those new things. So something to think about. We do have some pruning back episodes if you want to go back and listen. And of course we have an awareness of our listeners from all over the world. But of course, our perspective is kind of bound by the geography that we've had a chance to live and work in. So we always welcome, the intricacies and insights that our listeners have if they come from a different region, and things have to be done differently somewhere for a specific region.
There's like water requirements. I mean,
totally.
Many parts of the world, there's water shortages. And so that definitely trickles down to food production, drinking water, sanitary water, and then ornamental gardens. I mean, can be one of the larger uses of water.
Right. Yeah.
So being smart about that. So what we suggest, we interact with that a little bit, but it's not a dominant theme in our landscape design.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So if we talk a lot about the lushness of the Houston landscape, forgive us. We sometimes get inundated with water here. So it really is
water is actually a problem. It's like when there's so much water that there's flooding.
Well, and kind of along, I mean, I don't know if this is an elegant segue or not, but sort of along those lines, one of the reasons we decided to do this little series has to do with, I think both of us are the kinds of people who are kind of enthusiastic about a variety of different things. And so it's a variety of different spaces that we sort of get enamored of. So one minute we're talking about buying a house in the country and trying to start a farm and a nursery. And then the next minute, we're like, well, but maybe we should be closer to the art scene and the museums of the city.
And all the like the diverse cultural traditions in the city.
Yeah. And I think we've always grown up, so far the 3 regions I've lived in, so the San Francisco Bay Area, the New York metropolitan area, and then now Houston has that really special mix of vibrant city center and then sort of ringed by nicely developed suburbs and then out into really gorgeous kind of rural communities. And then if you're really lucky and can get out just a little further, then there's often those really beautiful wild spaces that we like. So we keep exploring those more while we're here in Texas. So we've worked our way through the rural and the suburban, and now we're talking about the urban environment and considerations for landscape design there. And we certainly, it's an environment with which we're both familiar as former residents of New York City. I lived in Manhattan, you lived in Brooklyn, and that was pure, I was in a 6th floor walk up, which
I lived in brownstones.
I was in very good shape at the time.
You see, there's so much walking.
Oh yeah,
I was
great.
Too.
Yeah,
we were reflecting on that city life. To me, good cities are very pedestrian friendly, and so New York City was a great pedestrian city.
Absolutely.
When I'd have family visit that lived in smaller cities, I mean, people have sort of walking shock, Where in my head I'd say, oh, well, it's like the High Line's a popular destination. And so that is on the far west side. That is hard to get to. So subsequent visits, we've driven in when we lived in a suburb and park and then
Yeah.
walked. You can still walk for a couple of hours, but
Yeah, I mean,
to get from
that's-
like Midtown to the High Line, I mean, a bus is or a taxi is not that fast. It's not much faster than walking, and it's a hike. I mean, it's because Manhattan, the blocks are wide.
Mhm.
They're maybe
If you're
2
going
or 3
east-west.
times as wide,
Yeah.
maybe even 4 times as wide. Once you get to the far west,
Yeah.
as opposed to the
Oh, yeah,
north
that's
south.
true. Yeah, no, I experienced the same thing. I would often try to like calculate the route that would be like the least amount of walking. I'd be like, okay, well, we'll take the short route. And every time I annoyed my visitors, my guests, because it would be too far. So you're right. The walking to the subway and from the subway and then doing your walking destination, which is like walking
Right.
through a park. I mean, it was not uncommon to get easily the 10,000 steps they recommend.
To walk for,
Certainly a lot
hours and
more.
hours, really.
Yeah. So walkability, definitely. But some of these things are not, I mean, we did talk about how the suburban landscape is often like all programmed, like it's all designed with the program in mind. And so the urban landscape is not necessarily, well, it doesn't always have the same intentionality, or the intention is like really based on the part of the city that you're in and the agenda that has kind of like gone
It could be
into shaping
manufacturing,
it.
like
Yes.
Soho or Lower Manhattan, or the
Which can change
repacking.
over time for sure.
So it's like it was a single program, like processing meat or textiles
Mhm.
or import export, and so now there's people living there. So some of those areas where the program has changed now they're very trendy.
Mhm.
If you notice, like the 3 ones I just mentioned, I don't believe they have large green spaces. I
Mhm.
mean, it's all built out.
Right.
So there's small parks, there's beautiful street trees. The city's creatively used intersections where instead of being paving, it's like a triangle, like a triangular park. There was a whole green streets movement where they tried to insert parks in those sort of throwaway spaces.
Well, kind of like some of those planned suburbs that we had talked about, where it was like the little triangular
Oh,
parks
right.
were developed maybe more organically at the time, and it was just an afterthought in some of the urban spaces. I mean, there does certainly seem to be a lot of sort of renewal projects and a big emphasis on accessibility in public spaces that there are. I can't think of the name of the park. Well, I don't want to get it wrong. I think I know what it is. But the parks in New York where you need like a key to go in.
Oh, right. Was it Murray Hill?
Gramercy?
Gramercy, right?
Oh my
Some
gosh,
of those.
New Yorkers, don't be mad. I never actually got to go in, so maybe that's why I don't remember.
So that was like old-fashioned. It was houses that ringed a public square. If you were a resident, you could use the park. If you didn't, you couldn't.
Which is not unsimilar to some suburban parks I've been to, where it's like certain facilities are definitely for residents only. I mean, that is certainly
Right.
a possibility. And so seeing all of these great public spaces, I mean, especially in a city like New York, but you recently had an experience with some of the parks in Houston as well. And it's not an entirely new concept because Central Park has been around for a long time, and some of the parks in Chicago that you've talked about, and maybe there's additional efforts to kind of expand them or adapt them to new uses. But the public park is just a great resource in some of our great cities.
Right. A contrast to the private parks in Manhattan would be Philadelphia, which has these squares, these green squares that are, I'm guessing it's Ben Franklin that was the designer. It goes, it's very historic. Those are completely public. There's more maintenance. So when it's public, there needs to be infrastructure and an endowment, more or less, to maintain it, because the things get worn out and trash, and so it's all sort of part of the public decision. How's this going to be used?
Mm-hmm.
And so my son and I did an outing to Herman Park, which is one of the main green spaces in urban Houston. There's Memorial Park and Herman Park. Those are the ones that I know that are very large, hundreds or 1,000 acres. So Herman Park, I had studied it, and we may have driven by it, but we really dove in, literally. It's laid out. Classicism is definitely part of it. There's alley's, traffic circulars, fountains, obelisks, lots of benches. It felt like some of the best parts of other cities I've been to in the U.S. and in Europe too. And it was very well programmed. There's a zoo. My son and I, who's a toddler, went on. There's a railroad, like a tram, which went for maybe a few miles. It was like a 20-minute ride. It's adjacent to Rice University. That is really gorgeous. Like, it reminded me of Stanford with the clay tiled roofs. And the railroad went through the park, and it went adjacent to Rice. There's a Japanese garden. There were pedal boats. There were some restaurants. I think the restaurants might have been shut down. But there was food carts.
Now, you were able to drive in and park relatively easily. Did it feel like it was connected to the city? So, I mean, I guess if it's right near a college campus, you could consider it accessible to the students that are there. But what about the residents in the area? Did it feel like it was well connected?
Good question. It did. I mean, it's adjacent to the museum district. So there's also, I'm guessing by looking at maps here, like multifamily housing, dense urban housing that's right nearby. I would guess that there's a bus system that could get you. There was ample parking. It was, socially diverse group of, it was all walks of life, families, single people, older people, running, biking. There were people, Tai Chi groups, yoga.
The multi-generationalism of cities and city parks is often a nice benefit, I think, to a community, that you have like the opportunity to just gather on multiple levels, like whether it's for a family picnic or just something about walking through. And believe me, I am an introvert. You wouldn't think I would like people in the numbers that they feature in New York City, but there's something about, I don't know, the interaction of being around people in a pleasant environment, but not having to interact with them. I don't mean sound like a crabby person, but
we experienced
that. There's something really nice about that.
We sat on a bench. There was Houston's all about water. So these well-designed parks, there's ponds, streams, fountains, boating. And that was the case here. We sat, there was a grove of bald cypress. There were dwarf wax myrtle under them. So it was shady. It was like a decomposed granite. I think that's used a lot in the parks here. So it's like a gritty gravel. And then an expansive pond. People were boating. So you feel like a part of the community, and there's almost no demands on you. I mean, if you wanted to have a conversation with your neighbor on a bench, you could. What it makes me think of too is for people that are single people, younger people, I guess people at any age, older people, elderly, cities can be very friendly because you can visit a park, and with the suburbs, that could be the case. But I mean, a single person jogging in the suburbs or in a park, there'd be a lot of other people like you, or an older person. There were older people sitting on a bench reading a book, or people playing checkers. So cities, that may be a strength of cities, that there is social interactions available, and just sitting on a bench, being part of the community, is available. Where in the suburbs, that's sort of rare. Like in my experience, it's possible, but you might be the only person in the park jogging or sitting on a bench.
Well, and we're certainly not sociologists. We're in the landscape design profession. But these are the questions that one thinks of if they're going into, landscape design on the civic scale, or even, part of the theme of this is if potentially you're facing a move to a region that's a little different, maybe following a job or something, and just knowing what the program might be in a way that could be appealing, even if you're thinking like, oh, cities, busy, taxis, buses, dense, loud. No, there is, thanks to landscape design, there are these respites or activities to engage in that can happen all over a well-planned kind of program for a city. Right.
This Herman Park, the flow was very good. And it's been, there was a plaque. So I'm thinking the park was well over 100 years. Maybe, I think it's from the 1800s. There's parts of it. I could be wrong, but something led me to believe that. So there's been all these iterations of different designers, landscape architects, planners, but the flow, it was very unified. It didn't feel, you go from a Japanese garden to a formal, like a European style alley with a fountain, and it was seamless. It wasn't jarring.
Mm-hmm.
And the user experience, there was good signage, benches. Yeah, it was I was impressed. What struck me, this civic planning and civic parks, I mean, it's landscape architecture and planning, hopefully at the highest level.
Mm-hmm.
And the scale was beautiful, that it was like the right scale.
Mm-hmm.
And in some of these suburban developments, it's also very beautiful. It's a park for that community. It's not a park for the whole community.
Right.
And so the public, this sort of massive institutional scale of some of these parks, instead of being alienating, it's like gorgeous. It's just, when you look, there'll be a group of benches, it'll be 4 long benches. It's very welcoming. It's like the right scale.
It's interesting because I'm thinking of, I mean, I love Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, but it does feel a little bit like a hodgepodge. Like there are some areas, actually they did a whole renovation of like the Cal Academy of Sciences and the DeYoung Museum. So there really was a huge investment in that park to kind of, well, I'm not going to say improve upon it because it really is a special place, but maybe just further develop it and the resources there. But I think of it as almost like these distinctive sections in a way that's a little different from Central Park, the way you can kind of just wend your way all the way from one far corner to the other. You know, cars, there is a lot of through traffic there, and you do see the cars quite a bit in a way that I don't think you do as much in Central Park. And this is just based on my most recent memory of the park, which is now getting to be several years old, so it may well have changed. But the thought of getting to the Japanese garden and then the botanical garden, I think, is like kind of adjacent to it. Yeah, the flow, just having tried to get to the different parts, I think is a little less organic than what you're describing.
It's like very subtle. When it doesn't work, like if you have people have electricity in your house, of course. I mean, imagine if it didn't work in every room, if you had different outlets in every room, like you have like a French outlet in this room and you have a German outlet in this room, and then you have an American outlet, that'd be ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that's what some of these parks, it's not their sort of big D design where it's the Starchitect or it's the wow landscape architecture, which has its place. But some of this planning and wayfinding and user experience, it's quite humble. When it works well, you don't notice it. When it doesn't work well, it feels like, oh, that's like 1880s. This is like 1980s. It can detract from the user experience. Yeah,
it just makes me curious to know more about the history of the design of that park. I mean, there are elements, believe me, that are just absolutely stunning. It's a tremendous resource. I don't mean to denigrate Golden Gate Park. The only thing that I was thinking of based on this conversation is that sense of flow, which really, it's like either, I mean, was there a master plan to begin with? And that sort of applies on any scale to the way we develop our own yards, because it's this idea that like, well, I'll take on the project of this little section, this bed needs some upkeep or something. And then we get into that kind of hodgepodgey use of the space. It may look aesthetically really pleasing in the ways that we have kind of updated the design, but that overall, like, what is the program? How are people going to use this? What are the views before you start like breaking ground? Or, you can kind of, it's so easy to run into that like, whoops, it's a bit of a Frankenstein.
And the materials too. I really try to think, can this material be replicated? Like when you need, in the US, it's like ADA accessibility, the handicap accessibility. So there's maybe a beautiful material, but can you use that everywhere? And having a stroller, I would imagine it's similar to a wheelchair or like a powered scooter. At this Herman Park, there were steps in areas. Now, there was almost always a ramp element, but sometimes it was like inconvenient. And it was not. Some of my graduate school professors, I remember them saying that designing for all users, and some of those people of varying mobilities, that you should start there, not to say, I'm going to do a beautiful design. Oh, and now we need people with like strollers. And so in some of these parks, you do see that. You can see that it's great that they made amendments to it.
Mm-hmm.
And tearing it down and rebuilding it, that can be very impractical. But when it is a new construction, to really starting from that level, because even like a 2-inch curb, if I'm pushing our son and you don't notice it, when you're walking, you probably might not even notice that. In Houston, there's often these 2-inch curbs for water. So from our driveway to our garage, there's like a 2-inch lip.
Well, that Emancipation Park was newer construction, and I don't recall going over any stairs.
You're right.
Necessarily,
there was a sunken playground. There were bridges.
Yeah, I can't say for 100% sure.
It was very seamless.
But
You're right.
Did seem somewhat seamless, and that's with a toddler who's moving at a different pace.
And there was grade changes too.
Yeah,
so that's like
nice.
Good design. It's so seamless.
Well, okay, so we've talked about. It's interesting because in the rural landscape, we really focused on like what are you going to do with your property, and then of course in the suburban landscape, it's like that but on a smaller scale. And then we talked a little about the designed community because that's a part of it. And now the balance of our episode has almost been on the designed community because the home property tends to be somewhat small. And of course, if you can afford a townhome and have some, or even a detached home, depending on which urban environment you're in, there may be some room for gardening. We've talked about small spaces before, and even indoor gardening, which we've talked about with regard to apartments. Anything to mention for the person who's gardening in their smaller property space, or even recommendations for how we interface with our city planners in terms of our own streetscape?
Oh, well, street trees are a big part of a city landscape. And so in some communities, you can request a street tree if maybe one died in front of where you live or there is not one.
Well, and those trees, you can talk, I'm sure, more about this, but they have to be hardy to withstand the conditions of a city. But nothing really beats having street trees. They help with the temperature. They help filter pollution. I think they may help if you've really thought through how they're embedded in the sidewalk. I think you can make adjustments for things like runoff. Any other benefits I might be missing?
Like the social. It's social spaces that feel safe have street trees. Is my experience. Like the research shows that too. Like areas where there's more crime, there's like heat island. It's hotter. There's often not street trees. So the New York City street tree, leaders, when they started that million tree program under Mayor Bloomberg, it was request based. So you request, I'd like a tree in front of my house. I'm in Forest Hills in Queens. And so they thought, that's great. We're putting trees where people want them. There were underserved neighborhoods where people were not asking for them, but there was a dearth of trees. So then they flipped it and it was need based. And so that made a big difference, putting trees. There's some of these areas where there is more crime, there are less street trees, there's higher incidence of asthma and all kinds of other health issues. So these street trees really do make a difference. In cities like Baltimore, I've gone to great urban and street tree conferences there, and they have a fantastic street tree program where there's young people in the community are brought in and employed and educated.
And you've pointed out that there's even a special term for this concept of almost foresting our cities.
Oh, right. It used to be urban forestry. So if you're a forester, you think of, so a more contemporary term is community forestry. And so what that means is it means multiple things, but it's all the trees in a city are part of a community of trees. So you have like a London plane tree in front of your house, and there's a small park and that has crabapple trees and sweet gums and sycamores. So it's all those trees are part of the community. And then it's up really to the whole community to help support that too, for those to succeed.
And I've been seeing, it's so interesting. There's now, again, it's just like maybe a headline or a short article that I read about this idea that trees can produce food And if you think about fruits and veggies, they can produce highly nutrient food.
Mhm.
And that there could even be, as there is kind of a resurgence in city-based local farming, there could be a resurgence in almost like city-based foraging. That if we were choosing to plant, we think, and of course, it's not that fruit trees grow everywhere or easily, but even something like my little sister and I, when we were little, there were the trees that they may have been crab apples, but they almost looked like little cherries, kind of. And those were very popular. I don't want to say we stole them off of someone's tree. I don't think we were old enough yet to kind of understand that perhaps those belonged to someone else. I'd like to think, because it was early elementary school. And now I'm narrating it. I'm thinking, you do not want to take someone else's fruit. That's no good. But if we knew that these were almost like urban supported orchards,
Right.
and people were invited to collect fruit for a season,
Like that is happening.
Kind of special.
I think it's Portland, Oregon, and there's other cities where that is occurring. It's like, why not have the plants? Oak trees are so beneficial because the flowers and the acorns are food for animals. And actually, indigenous cultures used to subsist on that also, making flour from acorns and all kinds of other products. So there is that. It's just maybe like the early days of urban forestry where you can eat the fruits from the trees. But it makes sense. I mean, there has to be some planning because fruits can make a mess. But so that's probably the objection. People say, "Oh, it's going to make a mess," but lots of things make a mess. I mean, all trees drop something. So why not have it drop something that's edible?
Yes. Well, when I lived out in California, when we were, again, sort of elementary school age, we would do a field trip to the Miwok tribe of Native Americans from that region. And their diet was heavily based on the acorn and acorn mush. So I've gotten to taste it. It's very labor intensive. And so I don't know that that's the ticket for feeding communities nutritious meals, but it was really wonderful to get that experience, to think about oak trees in a different way as like providing sustenance. Anything else to share with our listeners in this episode?
Another group that I'd like to chat with that's doing innovative work, Yale is one of the leading urban forestry schools in the U.S. that I'm aware of. So many of the people in the New York City Parks Department are Yale forestry graduates. So in New Haven, Connecticut, there's a group, an urban community forestry group. And it's similar to the one in Baltimore, where it's training local people to replant and to care for trees. And for these groups to be self-sustaining is ideal. So there's money, it's creating jobs, it's improving the community. And that's the one in Baltimore and the one in New Haven are both doing that. And that's, very exciting that it helps property value, it makes neighborhoods safer, it gives jobs. I was fortunate to grow up and always be exposed to nature, educated, but many people don't have that. So they didn't have that benefit of seeing all the benefits that trees provide. And it's like a foreign, it's a foreign element. And so I think there is a movement in the US, more awareness. There's more people in cities than ever. So making cities nice places to live for everybody. And trees are a big part of that.
Yeah. Our evolution is closely linked to trees. We had a millions of years relationship as mammals with trees. So it's not surprising that there's that affinity once they're planted and well cared for.
So your previous question about private garden spaces in a city. And so I have experience designing those also, courtyards, patios, roof decks, you name it. Even sometimes it's a sunken area. So a design principle for that is to be concise or concision, that every element ought to count. And sometimes there's requirements of, if you see that like rooftop deck, those plants form a silhouette. So in some cities, there's guidelines, like you can't have a palm tree peeking out, and on top of a corporate building, let's say, or something. And then there's also like load requirements if it's on a roof. So there's special engineered soils for that. So great urban gardens that are, I guess, public too, but particularly private, design's more important than ever because what is there ought to really count.
Yeah.
So having I've done designs where it's like quite a tall, thin planter. So the plant's closer to eye level. It's also, the weather's more extreme. When you're in a city, it's hotter or colder, depending on the season. So the plants, that's all part of the design process. And so with good design, it can be incredibly gratifying. I think, and these green spaces can be restorative and successful, but to be concise. And these big, large public parks, they're also concise too. It's not a plant palette. It's not the most diverse plant palette, but what is there, those trees are thriving and working. And it's like within the maintenance requirements that are available. And the plants look appealing almost all year. So yeah, being concise, I think, in an urban area, because there are a lot of demands. So to have it appealing and successful, there needs to be some precision.
Very good. Well, we've reached the end of another episode for this week. So thank you for tuning in. And we certainly hope we shared something in this 3-part series that resonated with your area of choice. If we said something that was a misstatement about your area of choice, feel free to share that with us or give us just more resources. We love it. We love being pointed in the direction of more information about all the regions that we love so much. The diversity is what is really, really special. So we will hope that you get a chance to visit a special landscape in your life sometime soon. And thank you again for listening.
Thank you.
Until next week. Bye-bye.
In the Landscape is brought to you by King Garden, a full-service landscape design, care, and education company. Enjoying what you hear on our podcast? We encourage you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen. We'd love to hear from you, so drop us a line at connect@kinggardeninc.com. We welcome show ideas, gardening and design questions, and always corrections. We travel all over North America giving garden talks and leading trainings. Check us out at kinggardeninc.com for our speaking details, and also take a look at our online course offerings for more in-depth explorations of topics covered on our show.